Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us today. Thank you for attending our monthly technical webinar series. Today's webinar is going to be presented by Daryl Townsend, and he's going to be discussing forgotten project risks. Before we get started, there's a couple of housekeeping items we'd like to go over with you. First and foremost, all lines into the webinar are muted. This is to preserve the quality of the audio for all attendees as we are recording this webinar. If you have any questions at any time in your GoToWebinar box, there's a questions submission box. You can submit your questions and time pertaining. We're going to try to answer as many as possible, if not all of them. And last but not least, everybody that has either registered or will be on the presentation today will receive a follow-up email. In this follow-up email, we're going to include a copy of Daryl's presentation. We're going to put together an Excel sheet with all questions and our answers. And because we are recording this webinar, we'd like you to share with your clients, colleagues, whoever you feel this would be important to. We're going to include a link to the recording of the webinar. We're going to turn the presentation over to Daryl and have him get started.
All right, thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you might be. Greetings from sunny today, anyway, Houston. Blue sky day. I see some of the names on the sign-in list. Recognize a few names, so greetings. Sorry I haven't spoken with you in a while. Anyway, we're going to talk about some forgotten project risks today. Some of these are forgotten risks. Some of these are postponed or somehow deferred. Some are eliminated due to a manager's decision or somewhat. And I guess this is not to say that this is all an all-inclusive list. There's probably many more specific to your project that may be involved. This is really, for me, it's an active list, an ever-growing list, and this is, I guess, reference to projects that I've seen recently, specifically oil and gas in the Gulf of Mexico and onshore projects around the globe. So here we go. We got that covered already. I think Dan took care of that. The safe harbor, the fine print legal. This is a technical presentation in our current knowledge. It's not to be construed as an official vendor perspective, but this is just a sharing of our knowledge. So you make your own judgments on the application of the shared ideas. Again, this list is probably not going to be an all-inclusive list, but it definitely is a thought-provoking list, if you will. A little bit about DR McNatty, project controls, some of our projects and services that we offer, cloud-based hosting services, software training, and then through that you can see that the software that we support with our tool matrix here. I think most everybody's in tune with what we are, who we are. And this is kind of just an abstract on what I'm going to cover today. So it seems many times, even after a project is run through a risk workshop, there are events unaccounted for, forgotten, or maybe even dismissed. Sometimes I see inexperience come in to play a role, and other times it's something that's mentioned but eliminated quickly for consideration. The team is confident, and I'm sure this comes up over and over again on your projects, that it won't happen again because it just happened on the last job. We have our eyes on it. We're going to make sure it doesn't happen. So I just want to explore some of those forgotten, dismissed, avoided risks so that others could maybe benefit. And this, again, I think to be a more sounding board or launching point, if you will, on some of the risks that do come up on projects. So if you've been in a couple of my risk discussions before, I want to recover maybe the risk definitions and some of the scheduled durations, just to kind of ground everyone on the focus on the risk exercise itself. And then I'll cover some risk types being considered, and then actually get into some more of the risks themselves. So for those may be unfamiliar with the risk concept itself. So risk is an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on a project objectives. So in some circles, those are seen as opportunities and threats as opposed to positive or negative. Understanding these risks helps better evaluate and reduce the exposure, increase confidence, and identify areas of maybe even potential acceleration to help. So a threat is obviously, well, maybe not obvious, that it's unfavorable to the project, negative circumstance, and an opportunity, conversely, is a situation that is favorable to a project, which creates a positive impact. Along with risk events themselves, there is another component within a risk model, and that is the uncertainty. And so that's just a lack of knowledge about an event that reduces confidence. And so those uncertainty items could be cost related, could be time related, or work effort quality requirement related type functions. So why would we do a risk event? So we want to identify or quantify potential events causing delay or cost increase to the project. And those could be several different things. We'll dive more into these reasons as part of my listings of risks. But incomplete design, that could be because you've gone to construction before you've actually got a issue for construction type package. Inadequate site investigation. Again, you've actually jumped out into construction to work on the site prep before you've actually done enough site investigation to know what you're jumping into. Unrealistic schedule or budget. In some cases, maybe that completion date is something that's been imposed by external forces. Permit requirements, always underestimated how long it might take to get a permit through a particular agency. Weather, obviously that's a big player, particularly in Southern California these days. Gulf of Mexico with hurricanes and those type things as well. A supplier or contractor's ability to deliver, whether that be a component or whether that be a work package. Public relations sometimes is not captured as for what it actually is, and unforeseen circumstances. Obviously, what we really want to try to capture is we want to optimize the project performance, identify those critical activities, and create some transparency, if you will, some predictability to minimize those surprises, so everyone in the group feels more confident in the project. So when do you want to do these risk events? So I've worked with and worked directly for several owners and contractors, and these is kind of an all-encompassing different ways I've seen it being used. Before entering into a funding gate, so large capital projects would have multiple funding gates to approve the next phase of the project. Engineering would be one of those funding gates, if you will. So before, during engineering, before starting construction, so you may be evaluating competing bids for equipment, for example, might be a range. And really, probably the fourth bullet is probably the most, what I would say probably is the most accurate. And really, it's as often as it feels necessary to capture, evaluate, mitigate, or eliminate risk affecting the project goal, which is completing the project. So some groups review a portfolio on say a quarterly basis, and they're looking at all of their projects. Some organizations review their portfolio or projects on a yearly basis and looking at their long-range plan on projects and how they might stack against one another as far as what phase they might be in. And in some cases, depending on how large the project is, you might have initiated by partner review. So many times these are seen as one-time events, but in large-scale projects spanning multiple years. You may have construction that may go on for 2 years, 5 years. And these large capital projects, transportation, they may span 5 to 10 years. And so risk assessments should be done frequently. And really what you're trying to do there is update the risk register, adjust for risks that may have fallen off the table and are no longer valid. Or as time goes on, there could be a whole another range of risks, particularly in long projects that span 5 years or more, where you have a whole nother series of risks actually become bubbling to the surface. So proactively performing those risks is best done throughout the life cycle and not just early on in the project and expect that to carry on. So duration uncertainty is another aspect, kind of separate from what I would consider a risk event. So questions to ask about durations, and again with duration uncertainty, you really don't know. It's an estimate, right? So you don't know until the activity is actually complete before you would actually say you know exactly how long a particular activity may take. So things to ask to find out how comfortable you are with the actual duration that's in your deterministic schedule. Have you used this contractor before? So you may know past performance on how well they perform or how poorly they may perform. Are you using them now on another project? Or is other work being done in the region by the same contractor on another project potentially? Do you have other competing work in the region that could be trying to use the same set of resources? What's the contracting strategy in other projects that are in the area? Are they all lump sum? Are they time and material? Are you trying to install serial number 1, the first of its kind, whether it be a piece of equipment or a particular process maybe? Long periods of known inclement weather. That could be hot or cold. I've done project reviews for Cutter Gas and in Cutter in July, and it's 120 outside, and it's really it's a dry heat though, but it doesn't matter. It's hot, right? And then I've also lived in Alaska for a long time, and you have long periods between October and May that it could be significantly cold, affecting productivity. So another one might be multiple handoffs and responsibilities. So are you expected to take and go through multiple gates or pass off through multiple approvals, particularly if you have partners? So all of these questions could help influence the durations of activities, and some of the answers are best dealt with the activity duration uncertainty, and then others that you may have to have experience doing are modeled better as risk events. So a couple of more questions on the scheduled durations. How confident is the team on the established deterministic? Are they comfortable? Do people feel they're aggressive? Confidence in those durations goes a long way toward achieving that confidence, right? Applying ranges around the duration is the opportunity to get differing opinions about the subject durations. Has the team been involved? Project team buy-in is key. So if these ranges have been determined by 1 or 2 people out of the project team, there's probably little chance that the room full of project members are going to accept the ranging. Careful about being too optimistic. We're typically a room full of problem solvers, and everyone's going to say it can't get that bad, or it won't go that long. There's no way. And don't let management expectations drive those ranges to a predetermined result. In fact, I was on a review in October, and they intensively preferred not to have management in the room when we did these reviews. So uncertainty ranges can be as easy or complicated as you want to make it. Can be assigned at the activity level, the WBS level, the project level, or even at a portfolio level using either Primavera risk or Acumen risk. You may compare durations to past performance if it's available. Now, obviously, that's the best way to get a hold of your benchmarking. So be careful to avoid adding discrete uncertainty in the activities. While you think you might be able to add a little bit of inclement weather, partial day, cut short because of rain, don't try to build in rain days or hurricane or something like that into the actual duration uncertainty. Those are really discrete risk events because there is some probability, if you will, of those events not occurring, whereas the activities in the schedule are actually all 100% probable of occurring. So the risk register, was it established by the project team? Most experienced teams had developed one. Could be an Excel sheet or even on a napkin, but is risk even considered as part of the schedule development? And then one of my favorites I've heard a few times is there is no risk on the project. So as soon as I hear that, I ask them, so is the project being installed outside? Do you have contractors working on the project? Do you have multiple partners? Are you purchasing equipment from vendors? Is the project overseas or remote? And then the light bulb kind of comes on and they say, oh, yeah. Oh, I get it now. Identifying risk. So don't underestimate or dismiss a risk as it surfaces. We had a number of reviews back in September, October on a couple of projects, and I saw a couple of times where some of the players that started to introduce some risk actually got a little more apprehensive because they were seen as being not as being risk that wouldn't occur on a particular project because of whatever reason. But so don't try to eliminate or mitigate the risk before getting it to the register. There's obviously a chance to mitigate a particular risk, but let's just capture it first, put it on the risk register, just identify it, and then we can decide at a later time how to mitigate or if that risk needs to be applied even to the model. So risk can be assigned to one or multiple activities, and really let the software work for you and return the results. Don't try to modify the inputs to get an acceptable outcome. One of my first risk reviews that I did, I made the mistake of actually making the changes and then actually on the screen real time showing the results, and the results were not well received, and the project manager wanted us to go straight into the duration uncertainty and into the risk events and actually start making tweaks to the probabilities and to the ranges to try to get an acceptable outcome. So really the point is to get those results and use those as triggers to get those key drivers causing the most significant delay and try to get those that are most influential to be minimized or reduced to improve your schedule. So there's a number of risks, and I try to categorize some to internal and external. So internal for me is something that we can manage internally without outside support and generally can be managed. And external, I see as a couple different ways. They may be within the company but not project specific. You obviously have less ability to control, but you may be able to influence. And then there could be some others that are outside the company, whether that be with a partner or an agency, and then obviously external to the project, a team that you have no control over would be a weather event or acts of God. So managing risk, so you have the ability to mitigate and decide how to mitigate. So those four: avoid, transfer, reduce, or accept would be the mitigation types that you would try to go through in each one of your risks. So another internal risk would be partner issues. So And if it's a large enough project, the more partners you have, maybe the more challenging it becomes. You have a misalignment on partners. Maybe a technical issue, it may be a solution, could be something as simple as how we're going to fund, or at what level are we going to fund this particular issue. Overlap between engineering, design, purchasing, and construction. So there's pressure to meet certain deadlines. They may be pushing projects to construction before engineering is complete, for example. And a contractor would say this last statement. An owner might not say this initially himself, but there's much more owner involvement in projects. Many of the owners that I contact and have conversation with now used to be a contractor, and so they have a hard time in some cases to separate themselves and actually operate or work more as the owner as opposed to still a contractor. So there's a lot more details that the contractor may have or is used to carrying out on his own, has a lot more hands involved in his decision process. Some other internal risk, brownfield, taking additional time not expected. So by that, for those not aware, there's two construction types, essentially brownfield and greenfield. Greenfield would be a completely new facility with nothing around. A brownfield would be a facility that you're actually upgrading or adding to an already existing. So brownfield, you're stepping into some unknowns. If the field or the facility's been around, I worked on a couple in the Gulf of Mexico region. The facilities actually had been around since the 50s, so there was a lot more underground that was actually unaware. And actually, in some couple of cases, we had to as-built a couple of pipe racks because so much had changed and the drawings hadn't been updated. Extended approval times, funding approval, maybe design approval, could be purchase orders, especially things that involve multiple partners, and they just seem to take a lot longer than you would imagine. So the PO approval process that you should think should take 2 to 3 or 4 weeks. I've seen it all laid out, and it turns out it takes 16 weeks because you have create a short list, and you have a bid clarification meeting, and then you have back and forth a few times. So it could take 3 to 4 or 6 months, and you might have only put in 3 or 4 in the schedule thinking you would get it done. Authority limits set at a wrong level. So I was working on one project where the authority limits were set to the point it was a multi-billion-dollar job, but because of where they set the limits, it actually had to go not just to the partner, it actually had to go to board of directors. And they did that exercise once, and they went back and revised all their authority limits because the board of directors only met once a month, and then there was a couple of months during the year that they didn't meet because of holidays. Here's a risk that I categorize internal or external. Logistics. I don't think it's fully appreciated. So the transport of equipment, materials, anything coming from overseas or customs, you can expect 30 to 90 days without much trouble. I've seen it go beyond 90 days depending on where it's coming from. You have oversized or heavy loads requiring escort. You have power or lighting for temporary relocation. Load restrictions certain time of the year. You get into the northern climates, and during freeze thaw cycles, there are some restrictions on how heavy the load may be able to transport across a given road. Limited access to site. I was reviewing a project late last year, and there was only one road in and out. And so if that bridge happened to have issues, or actually in this case it was limited weight-wise, so everything was going to have to come in a different way other than that one road. Road construction or upgrade required in that particular case. local traffic considerations. So this particular one road in and out actually went by the facility and actually continued on to the main town in the area, and that was the main road for school buses and everything else going in and out. So there was going to be some consideration having to be given during those school zone time frames to not be actually on the road with a heavy load. Resources housed off-site. This same project that I was reviewing actually bussed most people from a parking lot. Either they were housed in that area, or if they weren't housed in the area, lived in the region, they drove and parked in the parking lot. So I left early when I was doing the training class there, and I counted 60 buses, and that wasn't all of them. But all of those buses are going back and forth, transferring people in and out of the site because there's 6,000 workers there at the time. So the transport to and from, that's a lot more intense. I was reviewing the Cutter Gas project in Cutter, and they actually bussed everyone off site for lunch. So there was a real productivity issue, and at that time there was 4 trains being built for an LNG facility, and there was 50,000 workers there. So you can imagine the resources and the transportation mess there. Weather happens to be a pretty big one. In fact, it's big enough that AACE has a recommended practice, 84R-13, to talk through some of that. Regular weather expected, generally nothing more than rain. That can be managed. Obviously, if you have several days of extended rain, then the game changes a little bit. Something we hadn't considered on a project with a client recently is lightning in the area. So they have a 5-mile radius of lightning. If it happens, that shuts the guys down, and they have to go to a safe zone. Well, in August, September, when it's warm and humid in the Gulf Coast region, you could see that sort of storm bubbling up every day in the afternoon, 3 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and so you end up shutting down. In that one particular case, every day for 2 weeks they shut down at 2 o'clock because by the time things had passed, it was time to go home. Flooding during a crucial phase causing shutdown. So if they're doing site prep at the time they start getting some of these heavy rains, obviously you're not running a D9 through a gravel pad after 5 or 6 inches of rain and expecting to get it out later. Construction during hurricane season. So there's a certain time window for hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, basically through June to November. The concentration highest is September-October time frame. So if you can adjust your construction so that you're out of that window, then that's even better. But obviously if you can't, construction's going on for 2 or 3 years, you just have to manage that. In winter, in the northern climates, major storm come in, and you just really have to deal with a lot more issues. I think I cover it here in the next couple of pages. So you have extreme heat or cold. So in the West Texas region that I reviewed some projects, you have to deal with heat stroke, exhaustion. In West Texas, again, we had times of the year where we had to deal with insects, and we had actually a rattlesnake issue where we had lots of rattlesnakes in the area. The insects themselves, so when the weather was changing and starting to get cooler, the wasp and hornets were trying to find warm places to stay, and so they basically enclosed areas you would expect to find large groupings of wasp or hornets, which we had to deal with because in some cases it's a pretty bad thing if someone's allergic to some of those. Extreme cold requiring frequent breaks, so that you would expect reduced productivity there because of those shutdowns. And then I know from personal experience in extreme cold, hydraulic equipment starts to break down at about -30 Fahrenheit, the hydraulic equipment, the hydraulic fluid starts to gel up. And then there's obviously some other, maybe not considered, some secondary effects. So after rain, you've got to deal with mud conditions. So if you have poor drainage, then that mud condition could continue for a long period of time. You have to deal with that from a safety standpoint, getting on your shoes and carrying it and tracking it everywhere, as well as any equipment. And then you've also got to deal with mold and mildew removal conditions. And all these events happening during a construction cycle obviously play into extended durations for being able to carry on construction. And then also you've got to deal with snow and ice removal in order to do those things. So it's all these things that take additional time you might not have considered in the range of durations. Another external risk, regulatory changes. If the project's going on for extended period of time, things that happen in the industry could affect the way services are produced. There may be a safety requirement that came into play before you place your order, or after you've done your PO but before you place your order, or vice versa. So there could be some additional time required for any piece of equipment. You may have noise restrictions during construction windows, the traffic restrictions I mentioned before, because of the local traffic considerations. You may have air permit restrictions during that same construction window. And then from a financial perspective, you got the global market volatility. So if you're working on a project overseas, and the way the foreign exchange and the way the dollar moves, ebbs and flows over the course of time with the market, your financial side of things could be changed. And then just market conditions themselves that may change during construction, and the focus may flip on you. An internal technical risk might be a new technology. So if you're trying to install serial number one, you may have additional people that may have to be there from a vendor perspective to keep an eye on it. They may have certain expectations, exotic material requirements. So you may have, if it's a rare piece of equipment, you may have a longer lead time than you ever imagined, and maybe dependent on the equipment. So carbon and steel piping, for instance, right now is actually becoming a little more of a problem because of the nickel issue. Performance of equipment doesn't meet guarantee, and so some of this is actually post-construction, but if it doesn't meet the guarantee, then obviously there's an amount of rework that have to be done before it's deemed acceptable and before operations would sign off on it. Or early on, the basis of design doesn't suit agency requirements. So if they've engaged a contractor to build this basis of design to submit for agency approval for a certain permit, and if they have to recycle because that design doesn't make it, then there could be issues. Another set of internal risk could be related around engineering. So scope growth due to engineering development. So if you've accelerated the project to try to get engineering complete so you could get procurement done, so you can get to construction, you may have a lot of scope growth during those overlapping phases such that engineering causes a lot more issues downstream on the construction side. Depending on the contractor of choice, you may have to deal with poor quality engineering package. In other words, the engineering package may not be acceptable to the contractor doing the construction. There may not be enough detail included. A delay in vendor deliverables, giving over the vendor packages of all the drawings and such. You may find out that the engineers can't complete their package until they know where all the nozzle locations for the pumps are or for the compressors. I've seen this happen a couple times recently. The contractor selection process delayed due to a tight market. So there's several LNG facilities being constructed in the Gulf region now, and they're competing for many of the same resources. And so that selection process ends up becoming delayed because they don't have the resources available to be able to execute the project. The contracting strategy may be acceptable. In other words, you may have expected to bid the project lump sum, and nobody wants to take on that additional risk unless some of the owners wants to manage some of that risk. You may have an issue in engineering where you have too many concurrent tasks to accomplish, so you've only got so many people that can do the job, and so stacking concurrent tasks, which involves the same people, obviously something's not going to get done. Another one that I see happen pretty frequently, all associated with what I've just spoken of, the engineering, is a poor management of change. So if you're making a lot of changes on the fly, if you're not keeping up with those changes, on the backside, those changes could come back to really get you. From a procurement standpoint, serial number one material, I mentioned it before, extended lead time, it may be extended testing, you may have additional vendor help, if you will, on the location to get you through this. There could be some requirement from the contracting that requires U.S. steel content. And depending on what your supplier is, that may add additional lead times to your steel deliveries. Competing projects for certain supply feed equipment. Those things all add extra time. A change in operational philosophy that changes maybe a particular brand purchasing. So if you operating an existing facility and you're adding to it, the operations team may want to use the same branding of equipment so that there's the spares will work for both, and you may find out midstream that they were planning to change to a different brand, in which case you've got to redo a lot more work. The suppliers don't perform up to contract deliveries. Obviously that's another big one forgotten. So this is one sometimes a little harder to grab or put your arms around as far as what kind of influence this could be to your risks. And this is more on the people side. So a key member leaves, or in the worst case scenario, he maybe dies. I've had that actually personally happen on 3 different projects where someone has died, not because of a work-related injury, but because of external events. A relationship between co-workers, or it could be a relationship between the owners and contractors. Obviously, those relationships are a little harder to quantify, but if those relationships are tense, it could add additional time to the work involved. Inexperienced team members. Typically, this happens when the resource pool is short and lacking, and so the same team members are scattered around multiple projects, and then so you're backfilling with maybe some inexperienced team members. Resource turnover. So you might not consider at the design phase competing projects in the region, but if you were to stack multiple projects, competing projects in the same area, you may find out that you're trying to get a welding discipline, for instance, in three different locations at the same time, in which case I know personally that the welding discipline in the Gulf of Mexico region right now with all the LNG facilities being constructed. It's a pretty big issue. And so it gets also back up to the inexperienced team members, in which case we have a lot more weld rejects, causing a lot of rework, which again adds more time to the actual construction of the facility. Productivity, it could be actual productivity with the resources, or I've seen it happen a few times where the progress milestones were established early on with the project when there actually wasn't much in the way of activity detail in the schedule, and they chose milestones based on the amount of detail they had at the time, and 3 months into construction they found out that, you know, now that they've added much more detail into the schedule, that those milestones they picked were not the good ones to actually use for progress payments, for instance. Another internal, well, continuing on the people conversation, some competing projects, I know in a couple of cases firsthand, where competing projects are trying to attract the same key resources, and so what you end up doing is creating somewhat of a bidding war, or you end up having to make changes or modifying your contract language to adjust compensation. You may have a completion bonus tied to it so that you try to get the resource to stay on the project until it's completed. And then with the long duration projects, it's even that much more challenging to try to get them to stay for a long period of time if their competing project offers them more money. And then local hire for key resources. If he lives local, he's more likely to hang around for the duration. Whereas if he's traveling and living in his trailer or going home once a month maybe, or something of that nature, then the likelihood of him leaving and getting a place closer is closer to his home. He's likely to take advantage of that. And something else that I know that some projects have had to deal with is that in the Gulf of Mexico, if a particular project, and I'm thinking of one case in particular where Golden Pass had to deal with Hurricane Ike coming through, took a direct hit, and the project got delayed by a certain amount of time just because they had to clean up the mess. But the first problem they had to deal with is that most of the resources in that region working on that project lived not too far from there, and so their first priority was to leave the project and go home and take care of their families and their homes. So they had some issues to deal with because their first priority was taking care of their families and not necessarily the project. So they had some issues dealing with trying to keep kind of a catch-22 where they were trying to get resources to stay, but at the same time honor their loyalties to their families. Some site construction, site prep. So over and over again in the Gulf, they've not done adequate investigation, and they find, you know, the site prep activities become really challenging. Just in a couple cases in the Gulf of Mexico, it's a clay material, and the solid ground is 50 or 100 feet below. So contracting strategy, I think I mentioned before, isn't supported by the bidders, which obviously adds more time to the bid cycle itself, which is going to defer or delay the whole project. Office field interaction. So many times the perspective on reality is different in a guy working in the office versus a guy working in the trailers. And that interaction between those two can actually cause some conflict and delays in construction. Higher weld failure rates than was planned. So that happens when you get into the resource issue that I mentioned before, having inexperienced and looking for those key resources. I've heard of this happening a couple times where they had an archaeological find during a site preparation, ancient burial ground or something of that nature that pretty much puts the project on hold until they can resolve the issue. A couple more construction, internal site utilities not adequate. This has happened. I've seen it happen a few times where they've selected a certain piece of equipment. They've run the load calculations on the power requirements and the needs, and they think they're good. And then somewhere along the way, the project team changes that particular piece of equipment to something different, and they didn't go back and recalculate the loads, and then the loads end up were not enough and requires utility upgrades, which may involve getting the local utility company involved, and it could be something power related. I've seen it happen with water or even the feed gas or sewer issues. Safety issue causing a change in execution. Somebody gets hurt during construction, and they do an investigation and find out it was because of how they were managing or how they were dealing with a particular issue. It could change the way the construction sequence actually occurs. And then something that we typically would not include in a risk event in the schedule as far as a risk register. I might mention it, but say I would exclude it, and that would be a direct hit. Particularly in the hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico region, and typically that the direct hit could be not necessarily your equipment might be okay, but you've got other ancillary issues related. I mentioned before the resources that would be there and on site would probably, well, I would go home, take care of my family, and forget about the project. And then obviously force majeure, which could be weather related, could be a strike, could be something else, piece of equipment damaged, or maybe a vendor supplier actually goes out of business, those type things. And then lastly, there's some tools that are impacting risk that they're a little harder to quantify, to put actually in a risk model, but things I just mentioned here. So that obviously there's some software issues, the automation. If you're trying to tie in with an existing system, there's a potential anyway of having some issues getting them to talk and communicate back and forth. Or maybe you change a control system altogether that requires additional approval time. You've got to go take it through the existing operations team. Something that's maybe not project specific, but in fact, I met an FBI agent last month, and his focus here in Houston is cyber threats, and those are potentially anyway large issues. And to think about walking around in a plant and the number of devices that are now are remote devices, or they're wireless devices as opposed to being wired into a system. CAD drawings require an additional time. I've been doing this long enough before CAD was around and it was all on paper. And now CAD drawings in some cases maybe take some additional time than it used to from the old days. SAP or cost system, integration between those systems, it may take additional time to get those two systems to communicate. Obviously there's another host of issues related to SAP or any cost system if you're only reporting actuals on a monthly basis, and you've got to allow a certain amount of time after the closeout of that particular month for those items to be loaded. So you might be getting actuals and actually reporting on them, 2 weeks, 3 weeks after the actual close of that month. And then some of that information is required for capturing the PO and the material cost. And then document control system could add additional time if you're trying to capture all project documents, which that document list could be significantly large. I think that's the last. There we go. So this is kind of a summary statement, if you will. So risk events can and often are seen as preventable, and so therefore the project team avoids placing them in the risk model. But these missing items actually many times cause the schedule to go well beyond their intended forecast dates, and only after the fact are they recognized for their importance. So past mistakes would tell that I've seen or heard a statement made in a risk workshop saying that we know what happened before, we know what happened on this project, but it's not going to happen on the project we're speaking of now. We've got our eye on it, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. So, Dan, we're to the questions.
Yes, Daryl, thank you a lot for the presentation. There were quite a bunch of questions that were asked. We're at about 8 minutes to, so we don't want to take up a lot of people's time today. We've taken about an hour of your time already. We'll get to a couple of them, and just remember that we will be sending out a follow-up email. In that follow-up email, it will have all of the questions that were submitted as a part of today's webinar. We'll also send you a link to recording of the webinar as well too. One question, and I'm not sure if it's a question, more of a comment about schedule details. There's not enough detail regarding design, deliverables, date expectations, lack of submittal details and approvals, and depending on the type of project, the commissioning activities. Does the project and equipment require startup, testing and balancing, third-party commissioning, etc.?
And I guess those are just more, not necessarily question, but just statements of other things that are coming up. Is that kind of what I'm reading there?
I think so, yes.
Yeah. And I agree. I didn't really address the commissioning side because what typically happens, or I guess what all of us are dealing with these schedules on a regular basis, that commissioning set of activities really gets developed by a whole nother group of players, commissioning team. Sometimes that team is not even part of the execution team and comes in some cases almost, it feels like, after the fact, builds a whole schedule of commissioning, and that commissioning set of activities sometimes takes a life of its own. Maybe in some cases as large of activity set as the original construction window. But yeah, I agree. And something I see over and over again and deal with a lot is there is a differing level of detail as the project progresses. Obviously, early on in the engineering, you may have a good bit of engineering detail, but you have very little maybe construction detail and even less detail from the commissioning side. So yeah, there's early on there's a lot of uncertainty in my mind because of that lack of detail and understanding exactly what they have used. 60-day duration, for instance, in a construction activity, what does that 60 days entail, and do they know that that 60 days captures all of the functions that need to be executed in that window?
All right, thanks, Daryl. Yeah, we got about 5 minutes left if you just want to cover like upcoming events, and then we'll do the master QA for all the other questions that were submitted.
Sure. So the upcoming events, West Coast Rail Conference actually would be coming up next week. And then I guess that following that directly would be the Western Winter Workshop, March 2nd through 5th. If you're in the West Coast, that's a do not miss. The workshop is that's really an awesome group right there in the San Fran, Southern California area. Um, Shortly after that, the Region 2 Northeast Symposium in Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. Um, Beyond that, we're into May and looking at the PMI is putting together, and this is, I think, the second year it's been uh, restarted, a College of Scheduling or Science of Scheduling in Atlanta in May. And then I guess I would mention before we close out, um, next month's webinar on March 29th, we're having one of the solution architects with Deltek, Tom Poland, come in, and he's going to speak directly to the Deltek Acumen suite of tools and where he sees 2017 going as far as the functionality in the tool, and maybe give you a glimpse in what expectations are coming out in the near future.
All right, we're going to give away about 3 minutes of float time back to everybody. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day and attending. If you want to look for any latest news, webinars, events, if you are not already signed up for our newsletter, you can receive, we send it out once a month with any upcoming events, latest news in the technology and project controls field, and it also has a listing of our webinars. Again, we appreciate the time you've spent with us this morning or this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you at next month's webinar.